cuckoo.
This is just what happened at the caramel factory.
Hey guys, yep, that's right. It's me, just little old Professor Greene's screen. Don't freak out. So this week we're gonna get a little weird, okay? It's sort of embedded, the weirdness, the bizarreness, the strangeness, the shockiness, the scariness, the sexiness of this perspective is kind of all embedded in this one little term I call transgression. And masks, it turns out, are important. So we're in week four of this little block of the course we're calling conceptual approaches. This one has got a one-word, simple title, transgression, that, as I just suggested, has a lot embedded in it, okay? A lot embedded in it. So I want to do kind of this time sort of maybe two openers. You know, they're sort of, you know, maybe go a little bit quicker each one, but sort of like two different kind of ways to start thinking about this problem. So let's first ask a really interesting question. I think it's an interesting question, right? What do laughter, shock, offense, sort of taking offense, right? Or feeling offended or insulted, desire, right? Having desires, desiring, being desired, and discomfort, feeling discomforted in some way, or uncomfortable, or awkward, or a little freaked out, as we like to say. What do those things have in common? All right, that's one way to think about this. All right. Well, there's a lot of different possible answers to that question. But what I want to suggest to you is that one of the things that they have in common, okay, all of these things, laughter, like sort of, you know, sort of joyousness, if you will, laughter, it's laughing at something, laughing with people, feeling shocked, right, or suddenly in a sense of awe, right, and sort of shock, feeling a little bit offended, maybe a lot offended, depending on the context, feeling desirous or desiring or desirable, feeling discomfort, feeling uncomfortable, feeling awkward. One of the things that all of these different, very different kind of reactions have in common is, you know, sort of something that's embedded in this perspective, which is a certain kind of irrationality or illogical kind of reaction. We're sort of in the realm, in this perspective, of two important things. The first of which is kind of the realm of emotions. Like, we'll call it mixed emotions, all right? Because all of those things reference really different kind of states of minds and state of feeling, and even not just emotive feelings, affect with an A, but bodily reactions, right? Laughter is also a bodily reaction. Desire is very bodily, obviously, right? When you feel offended or shocked, your body tenses up, right, in particular kinds of ways, right? When you feel awkward or discomforted or freaked out, your body is also having a reaction, right? There's a sort of emotive states that are embedded in this perspective, and there is also a sort of bodily aspect, right? This perspective really heavily emphasizes the bodily, right? And we're going to sort of, you know, explore that further as we move along. Now, as a, you know, sort of a way to open this, you might do a number of different things. I'm going to suggest, just as an example, you go revisit, probably many of you have seen it, this 2018 video, This is America by Childish Gambino, right? Probably you've seen it. What you may or may not have seen, depending on exactly how much sort of YouTube consumption you do, is the like multitude of reaction videos, right? So I'm going to sort of post something up here above my head, just as, you know, one example. There's like thousands of examples of this that you could check out to suggest that this is the kind of realm that we're in. One of the first things that you see when people are sort of first watching this video is an expression of shock, right? because of the sort of, and we're going to explore this term later on today, obviously, the transgressive nature of the video itself. But that sort of sense of shock and awe and even a little bit of horror at the sort of twists and turns that this video takes in trying to sort of reinforce this point about sort of radical racial inequality and racial sort of violent acts that have racialized dimensions to them are not a thing of the past, right? They're a thing of the past that continue into the present, right? Which is sort of one of the kind of crucial kind of points and messages that this particular video makes in a variety of different ways by embedding different kinds of symbolic elements, right, as he goes, right? And I'm sure you're sort of familiar with some of that, so we're not going to sort of revisit all that. It's just want you to think about like just really the look of people's faces when they get to these different moments in the video where something really sudden and oftentimes kind of violent or chaotic happens, right? There's a sort of sudden turn from sort of like, oh, we're just listening to a nice, cool, kind of poppy, interesting hip-hop trap video, and suddenly, you know, the dude is executing a guy in a warehouse, right, who was previously playing a guitar. The point of this is you can sort of see this happening on people's faces, right, as they react, right, emotively, bodily, right, through gesture, through their facial expressions, and so on, as they react to sort of seeing, right, something that really shakes them out of their complacency, right, as they're watching the video for the first time. So that's the first opener, right? Second opener. And this gets to sort of what's at kind of like symbolically speaking the heart, sort of what's really, really kind of at stake or at the heart of this proposal that I'm calling transgression, right, or the transgressive approach. So I want you to think about 3 or 4 different kind of common, super common kind of colloquial phrases that we all use in slightly different contexts. Let's say you're into sports. Let's say you play sports or you're just really into sports as a sports fan, whatever. What does it mean when in a sports context, like a coach is maybe sort of standing on the sidelines and yelling to his or her players, push yourself, push yourself. What does that mean, right? The implicit push yourself is push yourself past a limit, right? Sort of like work harder, do more, like sort of tap in sort of to a deeper level of sort of, you know, sort of sports talent that you might have, right? Whatever the given sort of sports context is. Push yourself means push yourself past the limit you are currently confronting, right? Notice that that's a fundamentally good thing in that context, right? It's good to push yourself in a sports context, right? We all know that, right? You certainly know that if you are in fact involved in sports. Second example. Now let's take ourselves to a different context, like an intellectual context, an academic context, maybe a sort of scientific laboratory, something like that. Someone tells the scientist or the laboratory person, hey, that's a really important breakthrough. What has been broken through in that context? A boundary of some sort, right? A knowledge boundary, if in the case of sort of science or an academic sort of setting, right? Sort of breaking through again, a limit, a boundary, a line that was previously sort of limiting people in some particular way. It's a good thing, right? A good thing. Again, 1 or 2 more contexts and colloquial phrases that we often use. Man, you're really pushing the boundaries, all right? Said to an artist, a musician, right? Somebody in a more kind of creative or artistic role, also a fundamentally good thing, right? You're really pushing the boundaries. Again, here it's explicit rather than left implicit. Break through or push yourself where the limit or the boundary is left implicit. The boundary is explicitly stated. You're pushing the boundaries, right? With your song, with your video, with this painting that you did, whatever it is, right? In some sort of creative or artistic realm. Third time, also a fundamentally positive thing, okay? Fourth colloquial phrase, fourth and slightly different context. You're at a party, you're among your friends, right? But also a large group, it's kind of chaotic, right? There's a lot of sort of socializing and different kinds of things happening. But you're with a particular friend in your larger friend group that is just, let's face it, we all kind of have one of these, you're annoying friend, all right? You're annoying friend. Everybody has an annoying friend, okay? And sometimes we are the annoying friend, right? We got to kind of confess that too, right? And suddenly you get to a point where you can't really deal with this person anymore, and it's been kind of heightened by the context and so on. You're sort of maybe a tiny little bit inebriated, whatever the case may be, and you suddenly turn to this person, right, X or Y, and say, stop pushing my boundaries, right? Maybe you even scream it a little bit because you're just really irritated and agitated by this person's presence and the fact that they sort of occupy this kind of slot of the slightly annoying or maybe very annoying in certain contexts friend. Suddenly we're no longer amongst the good, right? This is now bad, right? pushing my boundaries in that context is suddenly not a good thing, but a bad thing, right? You're sort of stating to this person that, guess what, I can't deal with you anymore. You're sort of pushing certain buttons or sort of moving past certain kind of limits that I have for myself, right, that I don't want past, right? I don't want sort of you to be sort of passing beyond, right? So good, 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 bad, okay? Good, 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 bad. Push yourself, break through, pushing the boundaries. You're pushing my boundaries. Good, 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 bad. It is that ambivalence, all right, that ambivalence between good and bad, where the same basic thing is at stake, which is to say moving across a boundary, passing over a particular limit, crossing over a particular line. That is centrally what's at stake in this perspective. Okay, it's embedded in the term itself, transgression, as you'll see as we move forward, because the word itself, transgression, the trans means moving across, and it means essentially moving across boundaries. Whether or not that is a good or bad thing, right, to be moving across those boundaries, right, in any given direction, in any given context, is highly, highly relative and dependent on the context and on the boundary being crossed. Right? So what's built into this notion of boundaries itself is an ambivalence, right? An ambivalence rather than a sort of clarity, right? Sort of like good versus bad, super clear, column 1 is good, column 2 is bad, super clear, no confusion, right? No sort of mixing up of these categories whatsoever. No, in this perspective, this is where we get into the land of confusion and convolutedness and the crossing of boundaries, right? And the ambivalence between all manner and sort of things, starting with, for example, good versus bad. It can feel really good to push over or push past certain boundaries in a particular moment. It can even feel in certain circumstances really good to have another person push past your boundaries in certain moments, right, in certain ways, so long as it doesn't sort of fundamentally violate your sense of self, right, emotionally, bodily, physically, so on and so forth, right? So let's push on, as it were, to the conceptual shorthand of this particular perspective that we're calling transgression. Again, if then thus statement, to keep it super nice and simple. If culture is a symbolic order, and don't worry, we're going to talk about symbolism in just a second, what that means, what a symbol is, what it means to sort of do an analysis, a symbolic analysis. If culture is a symbolic order, the normative boundaries, all right, sort of normative practices, boundaries, and structures are represented in significant part through language, through symbolic expression, through discursive forms, okay? Thus, since symbolic expression, as I just suggested, and we're going to explore in some examples in a bit, since symbolic expression is inherently flexible and modifiable and even kind of turns in on itself, right, which we'll explore, one can also subvert. It's an inherently flexible kind of form, symbols and symbolism, right? Rather than super rigid and everything sort of nice and neatly, logically, rationally stacked up into separate columns, right? It's not like that at all, right? It's inherently confusing and convoluted and complex and ambivalent, right? Which is what sort of became kind of all condensed into that word ambivalence, right? Since it has a sort of inherent flexibility and modifiability built into it, one can easily sometimes subvert, i.e. transgress, normative representations by crossing boundaries, right? By challenging people's sense of where the boundaries are, right? And sort of moving them around, and right, sort of maybe sometimes very significantly, maybe sometimes a little bit more subtly, and anything kind of in between, right? But in so doing, in crossing those boundaries, right, essentially what you're doing is sort of destabilizing people's expectations and therefore challenging their accepted understanding, their given understanding of what the right categories are, or where they are, what's good, what versus what's bad, right? So what is it sort of that's kind of implied by this notion of doing a symbolic analysis? Well, for that, obviously, you need to know what a symbol is, right? And sort of what it means for sort of symbolic operations to be happening pretty much constantly, right? As sort of a fundamental kind of fabric of our lives, right? Of our social and cultural lives. And the short version of this, and you can take whole classes on this, right? The short version of this is that it's the study of representation, okay? Symbolic analysis is the study of representation, meaning sort of how this thing stands in for that thing, right? How there's a sort of symbolic connection or series of symbolic associations, sort of mental associations that we make where this thing comes to stand in for this other thing, right? And in addition to that, as I'm starting to try to suggest, and I'm going to show you hopefully very clearly with an example in just a second, Symbols are inherently kind of ambivalent and flexible rather than fixed, right? Sort of fixed in time and space. They only mean one thing. They only mean this specific thing or these specific two things to this specific group of people. No, they're inherently kind of like playful, right? That's the whole point of them. They're sort of really, really sort of easily modifiable and even kind of can invert themselves, right? It can mean this thing in this context and it can mean the exact opposite in this other context, right? Or to this other group of people, right? That's an important point. The flexibility of it, the sort of almost kind of built-in oppositional kind of quality of it. There's always multiple meanings and layers, right? In any given kind of symbolic field, right? Or any sort of series of symbols. This is even more so if they're particularly important, right? Or central or charged, if you want to think about it that way, symbols, right? Rather than maybe something that's a little bit more mundane or a little bit less important. So that's one crucial part. Second part is what we call discourse analysis. And this is just a fancy way, the word discourse is just a fancy way of referring to the fact that language, be it spoken or written in either variety, right? Language takes on a variety of different forms, or what you could think of as kind of analogous to genres. There are different ways of speaking and different ways of writing that can have their own kind of internal kind of rules and regulations and norms, or lack thereof. But they constitute within a given language different genres, different kinds of speech, like colloquial versus official, religious speech versus political speech, institutional speech versus like sort of slang on the street. That's what we mean, right? So discourses are just a different version or genres of speech, and that's another really, really sort of important realm for doing symbolic analysis, right? Because you can do an analysis of what words mean and what sort of stringing words together in particular kinds of ways in particular contexts means. And that's essentially what we mean by discourse analysis. Whole series of influences here. You can take classes in linguistics and semiotics, in cultural anthropology, obviously, in philosophy and literature, insofar as texts, right? And textuality becomes a really important part of this as well. Performance studies, there's a variety of different kind of things that kind of come into play here, right? And doing this kind of symbolic or discourse analysis, which are sort of the nuts and bolts of how to do an analysis of what might be constituted as transgressive, right? An example of transgression. So let's explore very, very quickly an example of what I mean by the sort of inherent flexibility and even kind of built-in opposition of a symbol, right? And we're going to take on a very charged one, a very centrally kind of important symbol for many people across the world, not all people, the cross, right? Now, if I were to ask you, and I'm doing it rhetorically, obviously, if I were to ask you what the cross signifies, chances are almost immediately, given the context that we inhabit, where Christianity is the majority kind of religion, at least in this context of the United States, you'd sort of, if I were to ask you what the cross symbolizes, right, as a symbol, as a central, very heavily charged and important symbol in the history of Christianity, the first thing that comes to people's mind is words like salvation, right, sacrifice, the sacrifice of Christ, right, in particular, faith, right, a whole variety of sort of basically kind of religious connotations having to do with a particular world religion that we call Christianity. But if I were to sort of suddenly change the context on you, the historical context on you, and say, well, what did it mean to the ancient Romans? You might have to do a little bit of work, depending on how much you know about history and the sort of historical development of Christianity. But to the Romans, it represented torture, right, and public execution and public humiliation in the act of, publicly executing someone, right? That's what the cross was, right, for the ancient Romans. It was a sort of, literally a kind of state-sanctioned form of public execution for, at the time, the people they saw as heretics, right? A new religion, right? A sort of new worldview, a new sort of account of how the world works, and so on, right? Let's take it one step further, right? One step further. Don't freak out, all right? Please don't freak out, particularly if you hold Christian values. If I were to ask you what an inverted cross means, right? What an inverted cross means. Given, developments of probably the last 40, 50, 60 years, many people's kind of go-to kind of immediate kind of mental association is with Satanism, right? An inverted cross is somehow satanic, right? It's of course been used in various kinds of popular culture and think here, for example, of metal, right? Various forms of popular culture. There is a short-term kind of tradition there, in terms of popular culture. But guess what? If you keep doing your history, you would know that actually the inverted cross has quite a long history itself. Okay, so for example, St. Peter, among some others in the Christian tradition, were crucified upside down, right? And there are depictions of this. Why? Going back to the first point. Well, for the Romans, crucifixion was a very, very publicly humiliating form of torture and sort of state execution, essentially, right? Doing it upside down was simply intended to add to the humiliation, okay, in that sense. Right, so what I'm suggesting with this simple example, it's a very charged symbol. I picked it on purpose, right, to try to A, get your attention, but B, to sort of explore a really, really powerful symbol to show you that it has all of these different layers in multiple dimensions, some of which are inherently contradictory to each other, right? Sort of public torture and death is not salvation and sacrifice and faith, right? There's a very complicated relationship there, right? Satanism is not at all the same thing as like historical kind of facts in the development of Christianity, where certain Christian martyrs were essentially crucified in that particular way, right? So, you know, symbols, any given symbol, and particularly sort of really important charged symbols, often have this kind of built-in ambivalence to them. They sort of mean multiple things, even kind of contradictory or opposite things, right, in that sense. So what we want to do today is explore this particular perspective through three different key ideas. After now you have at least a taste for what's at stake in sort of doing a kind of complex symbolic analysis. So the first of those key ideas is this notion of the carnivalesque, right? And I'm going to sort of step back here and say a word or two about one of the two readings that I asked you to do for today, Bakhtin. We're going to leave the second reading for the reaction exercise later on this week. So Mikhail Bakhtin, who was a Russian linguist, philosopher, sort of literature specialist, just to give you a sense of who he was and when he was writing. The piece that I asked you to read, which is essentially part of the introduction for this book called Rabelais and His World, was originally his PhD thesis that he eventually, took him a long time, but eventually got published in a book form. And it's a really interesting sort of account, a kind of textual analysis, a symbolic analysis, a kind of literary analysis of a Renaissance French writer, right? So we're sort of talking about the Renaissance period that Bakhtin is talking about. So it's roughly 16th century, a time when sort of many Europeans, at least Western Europeans, were sort of fetishizing and fantasizing about their connections to sort of ancient Roman and Greek pasts, right? So they're sort of revisiting this as somehow connected or sort of kind of invented connections in a lot of ways between themselves in that particular moment. The 16th century, right, the sort of medieval period, and ancient states, right, ancient sort of city-states like Greece and Rome. And that's important in some of the sort of concepts that we're going to lay out today, right? So just to have that sort of in context. The writer that he picks up on, that Bakhtin picks up on, is sort of a kind of anti-Renaissance writer. He uses a tremendous amount of sort of satirical language for the time and place. He just deploys a whole series of very, very kind of transgressive kind of imaginations and imagery and language for the time and place. He's saying things that sort of for the sort of official powers that be, this is back in the aristocratic period, the sort of time of kings and queens and so on, and the commoner class and so on, right? And that's important. He's saying things that they would not have wanted to hear, that they didn't in fact want to hear. And Bakhtin is interested in that, right? So we're sort of, you know, using a kind of very long ago kind of historical context to lay out some key ideas that actually still have a lot of direct kind of relevance to doing this kind of analysis under this notion that we're calling transgression, right? The first of those is the idea of the carnivalesque, right? The carnivalesque, which is just sort of kind of inventing an adjective out of a noun, right? Inventing the adjective carnivalesque out of the noun carnival, right? And so you probably already have some sense of what's going on in this perspective. As I stated here pretty forthrightly, what's implied in the notion of the carnivalesque or a carnivalesque space or time or place is a temporary, and that's in yellow for a reason, right? It's sort of, the temporariness is really important here. A temporary sort of suspension of the official order, right? In order to create a temporary symbolic space in which social norms, and in particular sort of hierarchical status, forms of etiquette, of sort of the notions of like the right way to speak or the right way to sort of behave or the right way to sort of, you know, hold your body, the right things to do, sort of otherwise kind of official roles that you're supposed to occupy, those things are sort of temporarily suspended in order that people in this kind of carnivalesque context kind of engage in a freer form of interaction, transgressing or sort of temporarily subverting the hierarchies of official spaces, right? And the expectations that come with kind of normal behavior or normal roles, right? So I'll give you, the kind of a little bit of the context that Bakhtin is talking about in his analysis of Rabelais, this Renaissance or anti-Renaissance French writer, and then we'll move on to some much more contemporary examples so you can see how this continues to play out. We continue to do this, right? Create these little temporary symbolic spaces that are very carnivalesque. He literally has in mind the sort of festivals around Lent, the kind of popular class, commoner class festivals around Lent. Which was a sort of moment for celebration. And that's what gives rise to things like Mardi Gras, right? Or sort of, Carnival in the sort of Latin American sense, probably most famous sense in the Brazilian case, right? Where it goes on for like a full month, right? Or several weeks. Those are sort of contemporary manifestations of this kind of medieval practice, right? Of the festivals that were organized around Lent, right? The importance of this is it's basically sort of an activity of kind of the commoner class rather than kings and queens and noblemen and noblewomen and the aristocratic class. It's a moment when the sort of commoner class starts to kind of openly kind of defy their place, right, in this society, their kind of commoner place in the society. They get very drunk, they imbibe in lots of alcohol and lots of food, they don different kinds of adornment and masks, importance of masks, right? And different kind of garb to sort of pretend to be kings and queens in sort of public marketplaces and public plazas. They sing really kind of vulgar songs, vulgar for the time at least. Vulgar songs. It's a festive environment, but it's a festive environment, a party, in our terms, right? Essentially, one of whose central purposes is to kind of mock, sort of symbolically mock and turn on its head the official order of things, which is that they're the commoner class, they're the regular folk, and generally speaking, do not, have access to or even in dialogue with kind of the aristocratic class, right? So they sort of start basically publicly making fun of them for a brief period, right? And in the context of doing this, also engage in sort of satiating themselves with food and drink and sort of joyousness, right? And sort of this temporary space. That's what a carnivalesque space in kind of historical terms refers to. Literally, the kind of the sort of kind of Christian tradition of Carnival itself, right? But what I want to suggest to you is that there's a whole series of different spaces where this happens, okay? And there's different kind of things you might want to sort of emphasize and think about that happens in these kind of carnivalesque spaces. So it's not just a thing of old, it's a thing that's still with us. Several crucial things that happen. Inversion, right? If it's a temporary symbolic space where you kind of are inverting all manner and sort of kind of ordinary social behaviors and ordinary social etiquette, what you can or cannot say, what you should or should not say or should not do, there's an inversion of social roles oftentimes that take place. Gender roles, sexual roles, roles between different social classes, right? In that old example, sort of the aristocratic class versus kind of the commoner class. Nowadays, maybe sort of like rich versus poor, right? Or working class versus kind of wealthy. There's inversion oftentimes of various kinds and sorts that kind of happens in these spaces. There's a kind of communal and festive, that part should be fairly clear, there's a kind of communal and festive environment built into the carnivalesque space, right? It's a party, right, in our kind of common parlance in some basic sense, right? And parties have a beginning, a middle part, a kind of maximum point, and then they die off and they end, right? They are, delimited kind of times and spaces and places, right? That these sort of festive events happen, right? Because otherwise you basically go back to your normal life, right? And you go back actually to whatever sort of typical kind of conventional role that, you've been slotted to perform, right? Whatever that might be. Masks and bodily adornment, right, are super crucial in this as well, right? Sort of modifying your body or your bodily performance or the things that you put on your body to project a particular image to the world are sort of welcome oftentimes and encouraged in these kind of carnivalesque spaces. It's also very sensual and even sexualized in many cases context, okay? where sort of rather than kind of keeping sexuality private and domestic and separate and so on, we sort of open up these certain kinds of spaces where suddenly we're kind of publicly acknowledging our desires and our sensualness, right? Our sensuality, our sexuality, and so on, right? So all of these things are sort of at stake, and you can see this across anything from like pride parades to literally kind of the weekend party, not all in the same exact ways, right, obviously. To oftentimes what I do is suggest people, to put it in a really kind of local Bloomington and IU context, Little Five, right? Little Five at the end of every academic year is an example of this. It's an example of when you guys, the students, essentially say, screw you, to IU and to sort of your professors in your classrooms and kind of take over the streets. You sort of occupy the streets. You party for longer than normal, right? Longer than usual. The party starts on like, Tuesday instead of like Thursday and goes all the way through the weekend. You sort of, kind of disengage and kind of, just like don't care about various kind of institutional norms and practices. Like you must come to class, you must do assignment X and Y. No, this is like a temporary suspension in which you guys, as the subordinate class, as students, tell the institution and tell us who are in positions of authority, screw you. Like we're going to sort of take over the space for a little while. We're going to sort of be in charge for a little while. And we're going to engage in this kind of really free, sensual, right, sort of satiating kind of enterprise, right, for several days on end, right? Just to put it in kind of a local context. Second key idea, grotesque realism. Also an idea that Bakhtin is exploring in the context of this kind of anti-Renaissance writer, right, from the 16th century France, right? Here I have it basically sort of defined as symbolic representations of the body. So again, we're sort of focusing really heavily, emphasizing the body. Representation of the body as connected to its earthly, kind of banal, base, profane desires and functions. Sex, sexuality, desire, food, drink, right? Death and birth. These are also incredibly bodily experiences, right? All of those things that sort of connect us to our kind of profane in the sense of like grounded. And that's what profane means, grounded on the earth, right? Grounded in our kind of material lives, right? And the various kind of things that come with that, as opposed to, right? So that kind of understanding and emphasis and symbolic representation of the body, as opposed to the body in this kind of other versions that sometimes gets represented as sort of transcendent, perfect, right? Sort of idealized, right? Sort of idealized notion of beauty, or in more kind of spiritual or religious traditions, the notion of a body as some sort of like a sacred vessel that you must constantly kind of protect and sort of exalt, right? As a sort of sacred vessel. A sacred vessel for what? The soul, right? The soul, sort of romanticized or idealized in that way. Now, in the context, I'll give you a sort of more contemporary example in just a second, but in the context that Bakhtin is writing about this French writer, what he has in mind is a sort of kind of radical contrast between this kind of fetishization or idealization of the ancient Romans and Greeks, right? The sort of classical kind of romanticization of the body, versus what this French writer, this very satirical kind of anti-Renaissance French writer is doing at the time, which is sort of crafting stories that emphasize these kind of profane desires and functions of the body, right? So there's a lot of different kind of dimensions to the stories that he tells, but this writer, Rabelais, for example, tells this tale of giants. This tale of giants, one in particular, Gargantua, who, sort of every dimension of the story sort of really emphasizes the kind of profane, base, kind of banal desires and functions of the body. His mother has an incredibly long pregnancy. It's an incredibly painful pregnancy. She becomes really kind of insulting to her husband because of how painful and long the pregnancy is. When Gargantua, the baby, is born, who's actually a giant, right? Born as a giant, he immediately has a very large erection. He immediately starts demanding food and drink and sort of offending all of the sort of midwives who are attending to the birth. He's sort of, this is sort of portrait, creating this portrait of us, not just, in the form of a tale, right, in the form of a story, basically, acknowledging the fact that we all have this really basic series of functions and desires that come with, embodying this particular organism that we have, right? And its relationships to other bodies, right? Sex, food, death, birth, all these things connect us to other things in the natural world, the earth, as it were. and other bodies, right? And other bodies, right? The desires and the functions and the demands and the drives and the instincts and so on of other bodies, right? And in that sense, the grotesque, if you look at just the word, it doesn't mean gross, right? Don't confuse it with gross, as in, ooh, yucky, regardless of whether or not that's your response, right? It doesn't mean ooh, yucky, right? Grotesque refers to grotto, okay? Anybody know what a grotto is? It's a little cave, right? A little kind of opening in the earth, right? And so symbolically speaking, the grotto, as in the grotesque, is about, thinking and representing our bodies in relationship to their sort of vital emotional and bodily function and desiring functions, and even banal functions, like going to the bathroom, right? We all have to do it at the end of the day, every day, right? Maybe at the beginning of the day, right? These are basic things built into the bodies that we inhabit, right? That's what grotesque realism is about. To give you a much more contemporary example to sort of show this contrast, think about the difference between this and this.
Forbidden donut. March.
All right? Two really different emphasis, right? The emphasis is really, really different on each one of these things. The kind of, using the example of the runway model is a kind of modern instantiation of this notion of the body as a perfectible form, right? Totally perfectible form, sacred in its own right, sort of apparently sort of housing something internal that is also equally sacred and that will eventually kind of morally transcend into an ethereal kind of transcendent space, versus Homer Simpson, who loves donuts, right? Sort of that contrast is what's at stake. Sort of we're emphasizing the Homer Simpson, if you will, kind of dimension of the body, right? Its desires, its basic functions, its daily kind of quotidian, banal operations, right? As opposed to sort of idealizing it, romanticizing it, pretending it's this kind of perfectible form, right? Okay, in terms of symbolic, how it gets represented, in terms of how bodies and their interactions get represented, okay? Okay, third key idea and final key idea. This is kind of Bakhtin himself uses the term grotesque realism. He uses the term carnivalesque. So those come very directly out of his text, right, if you read it. I'm sort of inventing, as it were, a phrasing here, transgressive discourse, in order to put together a series of things that he's also referring to, right? Which are these different genres or kinds of language that we started out with in defining the perspective, right? Which are also super important. So what I'm calling transgressive discourse, which he's kind of alluding to in different moments, in different ways, are basically different forms of language or expression, be it spoken or written, whatever the case may be, that are opposed to and oftentimes explicitly prohibited from use in official spaces, right? In sort of official discourse. And when I say official, I mean like institutional spaces, kind of religious institutional, educational institutional spaces, political institutions, like sort of official public life, right? That we might sort of think of. Various kinds of super official kind of media spaces as opposed to maybe sort of very alternative or underground kind of media spaces, right? That's what I mean by official, sort of really highly institutionalized, and therefore they come with a lot of restrictions about what can be said, how it can be said, right? Who can say it, all of those kinds of things. That's what I mean by official. And these forms of language and expression that are opposed to this and that do operate in other contexts, right, oftentimes outside the bounds of these official institutional spaces, are oftentimes prohibited explicitly by institutional and official spaces because of their ostensible indecency, right? Which is to say, what he has in mind are profanity, right? Profanity, Billingsgate, which is a super fancy, hardly ever used word for basically insulting language.
Just as I suspected. Hollow, you metal-munching moron. Why do I surround myself with fools? Even the robots are smarter than you.
Abusive language, which is a thing. I'm not saying, I'm encouraging you to go out and abuse people with your language or offend people with your language, but it's a fact that it exists. Can't deny that, right? It exists on the street, right? Humor, right? Humor, right? And we're going to end on a note of laughter in just a second. dark and edgy thoughts, right? Dark and edgy thoughts as well, sort of like the kind of nihilistic or dark discourse that you also sometimes get, but is not particularly welcome in kind of official institutional spaces because of its edginess, right? Or being too kind of scary or discomforting for people, right? All of those kinds of language, right? All of those kinds of language is what he has in mind and what I'm calling transgressive discourse. And they also operate at symbolic levels to sort of send a screw you as well, right? To these official spaces, right? So what I want you to do is, and to have a particular example of this, is check out this George Carlin video. It's a classic kind of bit of stand-up comedy, and we're going to be coming and going with stand-up comedy as we move through the course. This is just a really good place to start because he's really tackling this problem of transgressive discourse head on. Who says they're always bad in what particular given context and why, right? That's the kind of thing that's at stake, and deployed skillfully, deployed tactically, as stand-up comedians do, right? It can, again, to return to this kind of point we started with, unleash both an interesting kind of affective and emotional state, laughter, right? Which has bodily dimensions to it. When you laugh, your body is doing things, right? Really, really visceral things, right? Or it's inverse as well, and any number of things in between. It's inverse perhaps being discomfort, feeling offended, feeling insulted, right? Which also has its own kind of emotional and bodily reaction that goes with it, right? All right, so that's it for this week.